The lake had a western arm that nobody used, and it took me 3 weeks to realize that was unusual. Love dark atmospheric stories? Subscribe and join the vault, and tell me the moment that unsettled you most. I read every comment. I should back up. In May of 2019, I took a seasonal position with the Ottertail County Parks Department in central Minnesota. Lake maintenance, which sounds vague until you understand what it actually involves. Dock inspection and repair across 14 public access points. Buoy placement and retrieval. Water quality sampling on a bi-weekly schedule. Shoreline erosion documentation, boat launch ramp, grading after ice-out damage. Basically, I was the guy who made sure the lake worked as a public resource from Memorial Day through Labor Day. The lake was called Prosper Lake. Roughly 1,200 acres, shaped like a hand with fingers spreading northwest. 4 arms total, each between 1/4 mile and 1 mile long, fed by the main basin at the center. Good walleye water, decent muskie if you knew the structure, a healthy population of year-round residents on the north and east shores, seasonal cabins filling the south, and a small municipal beach with a concrete boat launch on the main basin's eastern edge. I'd found the posting on a state jobs board in March. The pay was modest $16 an hour, 35 hours a week guaranteed, with a county-owned cabin included as part of compensation. I was 27, recently finished with a biology degree I hadn't figured out how to use yet, and coming off a bad winter in Duluth, where I'd been bartending and running out of reasons to stay. The position required a valid driver's license, comfort with small watercraft operation, and the ability to work independently. I qualified on all 3 counts. Marla Ostrander hired me over the phone in April. She was the county parks coordinator, had been for 11 years at that point. Mid-50s, practical voice, the kind of person who gives you instructions once and expects you to remember them. She mailed me a packet that included my seasonal contract, a map of the lake with numbered sectors, a laminated water sampling protocol card, and a 4-page orientation document that covered everything from boat fuel procedures to how to file erosion reports. I arrived on May 18th, a Sunday. My cabin was on the North Shore, about 200 yards from the main public dock. Small place, 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a screened porch, facing the water. Clean, functional, clearly maintained between seasons. Marla had left a folder on the kitchen table with my first week's task schedule already printed. Monday morning, I met her at the parks office, which was a converted garage attached to the municipal maintenance building in town, about 4 miles from the lake. She walked me through the equipment. The department's 18-foot aluminum workboat with a 60-horse outboard, the sampling kit, the dock hardware inventory, the GPS unit I'd use for plotting erosion coordinates. Everything was organized, labeled, in its right place. Marla ran a clean operation. She also gave me my sector map in detail. Prosper Lake was divided into 12 service sectors, numbered 1 through 12, each covering a stretch of shoreline with its associated docks, access points, and sampling stations. The map was color-coded, green for active public sectors, blue for private sectors with cooperative agreements, and gray for areas outside county service. There was 1 gray zone. The entire western arm, a stretch of shoreline roughly 9/10 of a mile long, was shaded gray and labeled in small sans serif font. Sector 7, no service. Every other sector on the map had a task list printed in the margin. Sector 1, 2 docks, 1 swim platform, sampling station North-Basin-01. Sector 4, boat launch maintenance, 3 buoy positions, erosion monitoring point E-7, and so on. Sector 7 had nothing, just the label. I didn't ask about it that first day. There was too much else to learn. Marla spent 2 hours walking me through the sampling protocol, 13 collection points distributed across the lake, water drawn at 1 meter and 4 meters, tested for pH, dissolved oxygen clarity and temperature, results logged on standardized state DNR forms. I wrote everything down. I was eager to do the job well, It wasn't until the end of my first full week that Sector 7 started to register as genuinely odd. I'd been out on the water every day by then, learning the lake's geometry from the surface. You get to know a body of water differently when you're working on it rather than fishing it. You notice the way wind funnels between arms. You learn where the shallows force you to trim up the motor. You start recognizing which docks belong to which houses, which boats are always moored, and which actually move. And I noticed that the western arm was empty. Not empty like a quiet cove on a Tuesday morning. Empty like infrastructure had been removed. There were no docks along that shoreline, no swim platforms, no mooring buoys. I could see old pilings in a few spots, weathered gray stubs poking above the waterline, but nothing maintained. The tree line came down to a gravel shore that looked natural and untouched. From the main basin, it just looked like undeveloped land. What made it strange was the contrast. Every other arm of the lake was active. Cabins, boat lifts, fishing platforms, kids on paddleboards. The western arm was a mile of shoreline that looked like no one had touched it in decades. On Friday of that first week, I was refueling the workboat at the municipal dock, and Marla was there, checking the week's sampling logs. I mentioned it casually, something like, "What's the story with the western arm? Private land?" She didn't look up from the clipboard. "Private ownership, restricted access, not our jurisdiction, just work your assigned sectors." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. It made bureaucratic sense. Private land, no public easement, no county responsibility. I accepted it. At the time, I did not think much of it, but over the next 2 weeks, small things accumulated. I noticed that when I was running the workboat across the main basin, every other boat I encountered, fishing boats, pontoons, kayakers, traveled in patterns that kept them at least 300 yards from the western arm's mouth. Not dramatically, not like they were fleeing, just a gentle, consistent arc. The way you'd steer around a shallow reef you'd learned about years ago and now avoided without thinking. I mentioned it to Dale Knutson, my only co-worker. Dale was seasonal like me, third summer on the crew, working the South Shore sectors. He was a good-natured guy, early 30s, didn't talk much about anything that wasn't immediately practical. When I said something about the western arm, just an observation really about how nobody seemed to fish over there, he was quiet for a second and then said, "Just work your sheet, man. Plenty to do on the other 11 sectors." He wasn't rude about it. He wasn't scared. But there was a quality to the deflection that I recognized from other contexts. The way people talk around a subject they've decided isn't worth opening. The thing that finally made me take it seriously was the sampling schedule. I've been collecting water samples for 2 weeks, 13 stations bi-weekly like clockwork. One evening I sat down with the lake map and plotted all 13 points. They were distributed logically, covering every arm, every depth zone, every thermal layer the protocol cared about, except the western arm. 9/10 of a mile of shoreline, a full quarter of the lake's perimeter, and not a single sampling point. For a water body this size, monitored by a county with a decent DNR relationship, that wasn't just an oversight. That was a decision someone had made and no one had revisited. I pulled up the county's published water quality reports from the past 5 years on my laptop that night. Every report covered 12 sectors. 12. And every report included the same footnote on the methodology page. Sector 7 excluded from monitoring per standing administrative order, 1987. 1987. That was 32 years of deliberate exclusion. Not a gap, not a budget cut, a standing order. I sat on my screened porch that night watching the last light fade off the water. From my cabin I could see the mouth of the western arm, just a dark notch in the tree line where the lake turned and disappeared behind a low ridge. The water there looked exactly the same as everywhere else. Same color, same texture, same slight chop from the evening breeze. But no one went there. No one sampled there. No one maintained anything there. and the county had decided that in 1987 and never revisited the question. I told myself it was probably contamination, old mining runoff maybe, or a leaking septic field from before modern regulations, something the county had tested decades ago and decided to simply exclude rather than remediate. It was the kind of boring, bureaucratic explanation that usually turns out to be correct. But the next morning, when I loaded the sampling kit into the workboat, I added an extra collection jar to my bag, unlabeled, just in case I decided to swing past the western arm on my way back in. I wanted to see for myself what the water was like over there, and at the time I could not have told you why that felt like a decision that mattered. The extra jar sat in my kit for 3 days before I used it. It wasn't hesitation exactly. The first 2 days were genuinely busy. A dock on Sector 3 had a rotted crossbeam that needed replacing, and I spent most of Tuesday and Wednesday hauling lumber and hardware in the workboat, measuring cuts on the water, swearing at galvanized lag bolts that wouldn't seat right in pressure-treated pine. Real work. The kind that fills a day completely and doesn't leave room for curiosity about things that aren't your problem. But Thursday was a sampling day, and my route took me across the main basin in a wide loop that brought me within maybe 400 yards of the western arm's mouth on my return leg. I'd finished all 13 stations. The cooler was full of labeled jars. I had time, and the mouth of that arm was right there, a calm, tree-lined opening in the shoreline that looked no different from the entrance to any other arm of the lake. I turned the workboat west. I want to be precise about what I experienced, because at the time I was still treating this as simple curiosity. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't breaking any rule that had been explicitly stated to me. Marla had said it wasn't our jurisdiction. She hadn't said I couldn't go there. I motored in slowly, maybe 5 knots. The arm was narrower than it looked, from the main basin perhaps 200 yards across at the mouth, widening slightly as it curved south. The shoreline on both sides was dense mixed forest, birch, aspen, a few old white pines. The gravel beaches I'd seen from distance were real pale gray stones sloping gently into the water. And those old pilings I'd noticed, 4 or 5 sets of them, spaced along the north shore of the arm, like the remains of docks that had been removed decades ago. I cut the engine about 100 yards in and let the boat drift. I was listening. That's what I remember most clearly. The rest of the lake, even on a quiet weekday, had a texture of sound. Distant outboards, a radio from someone's dock, the occasional thump of a boat hull against a fender. In the western arm, there was nothing. Not silence exactly. I could hear wind in the birch leaves, a faint lap of water on the hull, but no human sound carried in here. The acoustic quality was like being inside a room with the door closed. I uncapped the extra jar and leaned over the gunwale to collect my sample. The water was clear. I could see the bottom sandy, with scattered rocks sloping away into depth about 30 feet from shore. I dipped the jar at roughly 1 meter depth, the same as my protocol stations. The water was warm, not dramatically, not like a hot spring, but my hands had been in lake water all morning at the other 13 stations, and I knew what 62 degrees felt like against skin. This was different. This was maybe 74, 75 degrees. Noticeably, immediately warmer, like water that had been sitting in the sun in a shallow pool. Except this wasn't shallow and the arm was mostly shaded by the tree line. I pulled the jar up and held it, looked at it, perfectly clear. No color, no odor, no particulate. I capped it and set it in the cooler, separate from the others. Then I unclipped my sampling thermometer from the kit and lowered it on its cord. 1 meter, 73 degrees. That confirmed what my hand had felt. I let out more cord. 4 meters, 78 degrees. I stopped. Pulled the thermometer up a few feet, waited for it to equilibrate, lowered it again slowly. At 4 meters, the reading was steady. 78. I let it down further. 8 meters, and the arm was deep enough here. I could see the color of the water darkening below me into a blue-green that suggested real depth. 8 meters read 84 degrees. I pulled the thermometer up and stared at it. In a natural freshwater lake, temperature decreases with depth, always. The sun heats the surface. The thermocline separates warm upper water from cold lower water, and the deepest zones are the coldest. And that's not a guideline. That's physics. The western arm's water column was inverted, temperature increasing with depth. Something below was generating heat. I was still processing that when I noticed the film on the thermometer's housing. A thin, translucent residue, almost like diluted egg white, coating the metal below the 4-meter mark. I touched it, slightly tacky between my fingers. Within maybe 15 seconds of air exposure, it dried and became invisible. If I hadn't been looking at the thermometer closely, I never would have noticed it. I wiped my hand on my jeans and looked at the water around the boat. The surface had that iridescence I'd almost noticed from distance. On other days, not oil-slick rainbow, but a faint, shifting quality to the way light moved on it. Like the surface tension was slightly different than normal water. Like something just below was affecting the way the top layer behaved. Then I felt it. Not heard, felt. A low vibration through the aluminum hull conducted up through the bench seat into my legs and spine. Rhythmic. Extremely slow. One pulse, a deep, soft throb like a bass note, below hearing, and then stillness. I counted. 30 seconds of nothing, then another pulse, 30 seconds, another. I sat very still in that boat for maybe 2 full minutes, counting the interval. It did not vary. Every 30 seconds, a vibration rose through the water column and pressed against the hull like the lake itself was exhaling. I did not panic, I want to be clear about that, but I started the engine and left. I didn't rush. I backed out of the arm at idle speed, turned in the main basin, and motored back to the municipal dock at normal cruise. My hands were steady. My breathing was normal. But something in my chest had recalibrated, and I understood in the way you understand a stove is hot after touching it, that the community's avoidance was not bureaucratic, and it was not superstitious. Something was in that water, something large enough and active enough to generate heat and rhythm at depth. And everyone who lived on Prosper Lake knew it. Back at the park's office, I logged my 13 official samples and filed the temperature data into the state forms. The extra jar from the western arm sat in my truck's cup holder. I didn't log it. I didn't know what I'd log it as. That evening, I ate dinner on my screened porch and tried to think about it rationally. Geothermal vent. That was possible. Minnesota has deep geology, and while the state isn't known for volcanic activity, there are ancient formations that could theoretically produce localized warming. The DNR had documented a few anomalous warm springs in the northern part of the state. It would explain the temperature inversion. It might even explain the faint vibration tectonic microsystems transmitted through bedrock into the water column. The film on the thermometer was harder to explain. Biological? Some kind of thermophilic bacterial colony producing a biofilm in the warm water. That would make sense. Warm, stable, nutrient-rich water at depth could host microbial communities that wouldn't survive in the colder main basin. I was good at this, at building rational frameworks. I'd done 4 years of biology coursework. I knew how to construct a plausible natural explanation. And the explanation I built that evening was plausible. Geothermal source, unique, microbial ecology. County excludes it from sampling because the thermal anomaly would skew their standard reporting metrics, and they don't have the budget to study it properly. Administrative done. Except it didn't explain why boats arced away from it. It didn't explain why Dale's face had gone flat and careful when I mentioned it. Geothermal vents don't teach communities to avoid them. Through social pressure over 32, you put up a sign. You note it on the map. You don't build a culture of silence around a hot spring. I opened my laptop that night and searched the county's digital archive, a poorly organized collection of scanned documents that the county clerk's office had uploaded over the past decade. Meeting minutes, budget proposals, land surveys, permit records. I searched for Western Arm, Sector 7, and 1987.
The search for Sector 7 returned one result: a scanned memo dated March 14th, 1987, from the Otter Tail County Health Officer to the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board.
The scan was slightly crooked, the typewriter font faded but legible. Pursuant to ongoing consultation and in the interest of public safety, this office formally requests permanent cessation of all water quality monitoring activities in the western arm of Prosper Lake, designated Sector 7 in departmental mapping. This action is taken in accordance with agreement reached between this office and redacted on February 28, 1987. No further sampling, maintenance, or public access facilitation shall be conducted in this area. Compliance with this directive is expected from all departmental personnel, effective immediately. The redaction was clumsy. A black rectangle clearly applied to the scan digitally, not to the original document. Someone had blocked out a name or entity before uploading it. But the word that stayed with me was agreement. Not determination, not finding. Agreement. That word implied two parties, a negotiation, a mutual understanding reached between the county health officer and someone or something else. I stared at that word for a long time. Then I went back to the archive and searched for anything else from 1987 related to Prosper Lake. Budget documents mostly, meeting minutes that didn't mention the Western Arm, but buried in a batch of miscellaneous scanned pages filed under Lake Management Historical, I found a DNR fish population survey from 1971. It was a standard form: species counts, size distributions, netting locations. The survey covered the entire lake, including the Western Arm, and in the margins of page 3, next to the data table for the Western Arm's deep water netting station, someone had written in pencil, atypical thermocline, species absence below 4 meters, despite adequate dissolved O2. Water column behaves as if occupied. Recommend follow-up, as if occupied. I read that note 4 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark on the porch, watching the lake. From here, I could see the black notch where the Western Arm opened off the main basin. The water there was invisible in the darkness, no different from the rest. But I knew now that whatever I'd felt through the hull of my boat had been there since at least 1971, probably much longer, long enough for a fish surveyor to notice it and write something strange in a margin, long enough for a community to learn, through whatever process communities learn such things, that the Western Arm was not a place for people. It was almost midnight when I saw it. A glow, deep underwater, in the direction of the Western Arm's mouth, amber-colored, soft, like a lantern seen through heavy fog. It pulsed once, brightening over a few seconds, then dimming back to nothing. I counted. 30 seconds of darkness. Then it pulsed again. The same interval I'd felt through the boat's hull. I watched it for 10 minutes. It did not stop. It did not vary. And I could not determine whether it had been there every night since I arrived, and I simply hadn't looked, or whether something about my visit that morning had changed the situation. Either possibility was troubling, but the second one was worse. I didn't sleep well that night, not from fear exactly, more from the particular restlessness of having a question that won't sit still in your mind. I kept running the temperature data through mental calculations. An inverted thermocline strong enough to produce 84 degrees at 8 meters would require a sustained heat source of considerable output, not a trickle, not residual geothermal warmth, something actively generating thermal energy at depth continuously for decades. By Friday morning, I'd made a decision. I needed older records than what the county's digital archive could offer. The scanned collection was incomplete. Someone had digitized selectively, and the 1971 fish survey had only survived because it was bundled with unrelated documents. If there was more history on the Western Arm, it would be in physical files. The Otter Tail County Records Office was in the basement of the courthouse in Fergus Falls, about 22 miles from the lake. I drove there Friday afternoon after finishing my morning dock inspections on Sector 5. The office was small 2 rooms of metal shelving, fluorescent lights, a clerk named Bonnie, who seemed surprised anyone was there at all. I told her I was with the Parks Department and looking for historical files on Prosper Lake management. She showed me to a section of shelves labeled by lake name and left me alone. The Prosper Lake files occupied about 3 linear feet of shelf space, folders organized loosely by decade going back to the 1940s. I started with the 1980s. The 1987 file was thin. I found the original of the memo I had already seen, identical to the scan except that the redaction didn't exist on the paper version. The name was right there in typewritten text. Agreement reached between this office and the Property Owners Consortium of the Western Arm. Property Owners Consortium. I wrote that down. Then I pulled the next document from the folder, a survey plat map of the Western Arm's parcels, dated January 1987. 11 parcels along the north and south shores. Every single one had been transferred to a different LLC on the same date, November 3rd, 1986. The LLCs had names like Lakeview Holdings, Northern Basin Properties, Prosper Land Trust, generic to the point of meaninglessness. Beneath the plat map was a single handwritten page on County Health Department letterhead. No date. The handwriting was small, precise, and slightly shaky, written by someone older, I thought, or someone whose hand wasn't entirely steady. Residents notified, compliance expected, no further action. The arrangement is satisfactory to all parties. This matter is resolved. Below that, underlined twice, do not resurvey the Western Arm. Do not send personnel to the water. I photographed everything with my phone. Then I moved backward in time. The 1970s folder held the full DNR fish survey I'd already found a fragment of. Reading the complete document gave me more context. The surveyor, a man named Gerald Olson, DNR Fisheries Division, had conducted a standard population assessment across the entire lake in June 1971. His results for the Western Arm were anomalous enough that he'd flagged them for follow-up in his summary. Western Arm presents unusual thermal characteristics. Surface temperatures approximately 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit above expected for date and depth. Temperature increases with depth below 3 meters, which is inconsistent with any known freshwater thermal model for this latitude. Deep netting at 6 meters and 10 meters produce 0 catch, despite adequate oxygen levels and substrate. The water column below 4 meters behaves as if occupied by a mass that displaces fish without visible structure. I recommend a dedicated thermal and bathymetric survey at earliest opportunity. I checked the rest of the file. No follow-up survey was ever conducted. Olson's recommendation appeared to have been ignored or suppressed. The 1960s folder was mostly permit applications and nothing relevant. But the 1950s folder contained something that made me sit back in my metal chair and stare at the wall for a full minute. A geological survey dated 1952, conducted by the Minnesota Geological Survey as part of a statewide lake characterization project. 2 pages on Prosper Lake. Bathymetric measurements, substrate composition, basic hydrology, and a note in the findings section. Western Arm exhibits anomalous thermal mass at depth. Source unknown, not consistent with known geothermal features in this region. Temperature differential suggests sustained biological or chemical process at lake floor. No comparable feature identified in survey area. Noted for future investigation. 1952, 20 years before the fish survey, 35 years before the county shut down all monitoring. Whatever was generating heat in the Western Arm had been doing so for at least 67 years by the time I dipped my thermometer into that water, and probably far longer. The 1952 survey was simply the first time anyone with instruments had measured it. I photographed the geological survey and left the courthouse. On the drive back to the lake, I stopped at the Fergus Falls Public Library. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. News articles, maybe. Anything public that mentioned the Western Arm. I spent an hour with their Microfilm machine. Scrolling through the Fergus Falls Daily Journal from 1985 through 1988, looking for anything about Prosper Lake. I found one article, November 1986, the same month all those property transfers occurred. A short piece, maybe 200 words, in the local news section. The headline was, Prosper Lake Residents Form Conservation Partnership. The article described a group of Western Arm property owners voluntarily forming a land trust to preserve the natural character of their shoreline. They were quoted as saying they wanted to prevent future development and maintain the Arm as a wildlife corridor. The article named no individuals. It quoted the trust's filed statement of purpose and noted that 11 parcels had been consolidated under new management. Reading it fresh, it sounded like an environmental feel-good story. Wealthy lakefront owners protecting nature. But I knew now what those 11 parcels actually represented. A coordinated evacuation disguised as conservation. Every resident on the Western Arm had transferred their property and left within the same month. And 6 months later, the county health officer had shut down all public monitoring and called it an agreement. Something had happened in late 1986 that made 11 property owners leave simultaneously. And whatever it was, the county had decided to manage it through silence rather than disclosure. Saturday was my day off. I spent the morning on my cabin's dock with a cup of coffee, watching the lake come alive with weekend boat traffic. Pontoons loaded with families, fishing boats trolling the weed edges, kids on tubes being dragged behind outboards. The lake was healthy and used and full of people. None of them went west. I watched for 3 hours, counted 17 boats that crossed my field of vision. Every single one maintained that invisible buffer, the 300-yard arc around the Western Arm's mouth that I'd noticed my first week. It wasn't a rule anyone had posted. It wasn't a buoy line or a no-wake zone. It was just something people did. I thought about the temperature data. 84 degrees at 8 meters, in a healthy lake surrounded by people who swam and fished and lived on the water daily. Nobody talked about it. Nobody measured it. Nobody went there. How do you teach an entire community to avoid a place without telling them why? That night I made a decision that I've thought about many times since. I decided to go back to the Western Arm after dark. I want to explain my reasoning because looking back, I understand how it sounds. But at the time, I was operating on the logic of someone who has gathered evidence and wants confirmation. I'd seen the glow from my dock the previous night. I wanted to see it from closer. I wanted to know if the vibration was still present. I wanted to measure the interval again and see if it matched what I'd felt during my daytime visit. I told myself I was being empirical. I was wrong about that. I was being pulled. But I didn't recognize the difference yet. I waited until 11. The lake was quiet. Weekend noise dies down by 10, and by 11 the only sounds are loons and the occasional creak of a dock in the wind. I took the workboat out at idle speed, no running lights. Technically a violation of navigation rules, but I didn't want to be seen. The Western Arm's mouth was a black gap in the shoreline. No ambient light reached it, no cabins, no road, no neighbors. I entered slowly, watching the depth finder. The bottom dropped away quickly here, 12 feet, 20, 30. The Arm was deeper than I'd realized. My depth finder showed 47 feet at the center channel, about 200 yards in. I cut the engine and drifted. For a full minute, nothing, just silence and the slap of water on aluminum. The trees on either shore were black outlines against a sky with enough stars to give shape but no real illumination. Then the glow. It came from below and to my left, maybe 40 yards away. Deep, I'd estimate 25 or 30 feet down. Amber, exactly as I'd seen from my dock. But from this close, I could see it had structure. It wasn't a point source. It was diffuse, spread across an area maybe 15 feet in diameter. Like looking down through murky water at a lit room. It brightened over about 4 seconds, held for maybe 2, then dimmed back to nothing. 30 seconds. It pulsed again. 30 seconds. Again. The vibration came with it now, not just through the hull, but through the water itself, a pressure I could feel against my hand when I placed it flat on the surface. Each pulse pushed outward, a ring of sub-audible force that moved through the water, the way a heartbeat moves through a chest. I lowered my at 176 degree, at 4 meter 81. I didn't have enough cord to reach deeper, but the trend was clear. The warmth was intensifying from below. The heat source was at the bottom of this arm or beneath it, and it was radiating upward continuously. I was leaning over the gunnel, watching the glow pulse below me, when something changed. The rhythm stuttered, not stopped, altered. The 30-second interval compressed. 28 seconds, then 25, then 22. The glow was pulsing faster, and each pulse was slightly brighter than the last. And the area of illumination was expanding, not by much, but visibly. Where it had been 15 feet across, it was now 20, 25. It was responding. To the boat, to my presence above it, to the weight of attention directed downward. I started the engine. The sound of the outboard turning over broke something. The rhythm immediately decelerated, the glow dimming to its original size and cadence before I'd even put the motor in gear. As if my departure had been anticipated and accepted, as if it had simply been checking whether I would stay, I backed out of the arm at idle speed and didn't increase throttle until I was well into the main basin. By the time I reached my dock, my hands were shaking. Not badly. Just enough that tying the bowline took 2 attempts. On the dock, I stood and looked west. The glow was still visible from here, faintly at the mouth of the arm. 30-second intervals. Unchanged. Patient. I went inside and locked the door and sat at my kitchen table and admitted to myself that my rational framework had failed. Geothermal vents don't respond to the presence of a boat. Microbial colonies don't accelerate their metabolism when observed. Whatever was in the western arm of Prosper Lake was not a passive geological feature. It was aware, and now it knew I'd come back. I spent Sunday telling myself I was done. I had a job to do. 11 sectors of real work that needed my attention. Whatever was in the western arm had been there for decades, probably much longer, and the community had clearly reached some kind of equilibrium with it. They didn't go there. It didn't come to them. The arrangement worked. My role was to respect that and do my job. By Monday afternoon, I knew I wasn't done. It wasn't curiosity anymore. That's what I need to be honest about. Curiosity is intellectual. It lives in your head. It drives you to look things up, to ask questions, to think. What I felt Monday was physical, a warmth in my hands that hadn't been there before. Not painful, not dramatic, just a slight elevation in skin temperature that I noticed when I wrapped my fingers around my coffee mug and realized the ceramic didn't feel as warm by comparison as it should have. I checked with a thermometer from the sampling kit. My palm surface read 94.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal is around 90 to 91 for hands. Not a fever, not alarming on its own, but I hadn't felt it before Thursday, and I couldn't stop noticing it now. I did my work. I replaced 2 buoy anchors on Sector 9 and filed an erosion report on a section of Sector 2's south bank where spring runoff had undercut a mature birch. Normal tasks. I performed them normally, but my attention kept drifting west, like a compass needle settling toward a bearing I hadn't chosen. Tuesday morning, I found Marla at the parks office. She was doing quarterly inventory on the hardware storage room, counting lag bolts, checking preservative stock, the kind of tedious maintenance work that keeps a small department functional. I stood in the doorway and said, "Marla, I need to ask you about the western arm again." She didn't stop counting, didn't turn around. "What about it?" "I went out there last week, took some temperature readings. The water's warm, Marla, really warm, and it gets warmer with depth. That's not that doesn't happen in a natural lake." She set down her clipboard then, turned to face me. Her expression wasn't angry. It was something closer to tired. The look of someone who's had a conversation before and already knows how it ends. "How close did you get?" 100 yards, maybe less at night. You went at night. Saturday. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her voice was flat and specific. Did you put your hands in the water? The first time, Thursday, when I took the sample. How long? A few seconds, just to collect. And how do your hands feel now? I didn't answer immediately. The fact that she'd asked that she knew to ask told me more than anything. In the county archives. Warm, I said. She nodded, not surprised, just confirming something she'd already assessed. Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to talk to Helen Lundquist. She's on the North Shore, the blue house past the boat co-op. She'll tell you what you need to hear, and then you're going to make a decision about whether you stay through the summer or not. But you need to understand something first. She stepped closer, not threatening, earnest. The people who live here aren't hiding something because they're afraid of it. They're quiet about it because being quiet is what works. 32 years. Nothing has come out of that arm. Nothing has hurt anyone who didn't go looking. You understand? The girl in 1986, I said, the one who went in and came back. Marla's face changed, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. Helen will tell you about that. How many people know? Everyone who lives here year-round, maybe 60, 70 people. The seasonal folks, the cabin renters, the weekenders they don't know. They just do what everyone else does. They don't go west. It's enough. She picked her clipboard back up. Go see Helen today, this afternoon, and don't go back to that arm before you talk to her. Helen Lundquist's house was exactly where Marla said, a blue clapboard place set back from the shore behind a stand of white pines. Old but well maintained. The dock out front had been recently redecked. A pair of Adirondack chairs faced the water, both weathered to gray. She answered the door before I knocked. Small woman, early 80s, with short white hair and the kind of lean, deliberate posture that suggested she'd been active her whole life. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could only describe as recognition, not of me specifically, but of my situation, as if she'd been expecting someone like me to show up eventually. You're the new Parks boy? She said. Marla called, come in. Her living room was clean and spare, a wood stove in the corner, cold for the season, bookshelves covering one wall, mostly nonfiction, mostly science. She gestured me to a chair and sat across from me in a rocker that had clearly been her seat for decades. You went to the arm, she said. Not a question. Twice. And now your hands are warm. I nodded. She rocked. Once. Twice. Studying me. Then, I'll tell you what I know. It won't be everything because I don't know everything. Nobody does. But I'll tell you what happened and what we decided, and then you'll have to do your own thinking. She didn't offer coffee. She didn't make small talk. She started. In September of 1986, 3 teenagers from the Lake Summer Kids, children of cabin owners, swam into the western arm on a dare, middle of the day. 1 boy and 2 girls. The boy and 1 girl made it about 50 yards in, felt the warmth, got spooked, and turned back. They said later it felt like swimming into a bath. The water got warm so fast it startled them. The 3rd one, a girl named Christine, kept going. 17 years old, strong swimmer, lifeguard at her high school pool. She went further in. Her friends watched from the mouth of the arm. They said she stopped swimming about 100 yards in and just floated there, treading water, looking down. They yelled at her to come back. She didn't respond. Then she went under. Helen paused. Her hands were folded in her lap, perfectly still. They found her body? No, she wasn't in the water. She wasn't anywhere. For 3 days she was gone. Sheriff's department searched, dive team went in, and that was the last time anyone officially entered that water. The divers reported, I'll tell you what they reported. They said the water below 10 meters was too warm to be comfortable in a wetsuit. They said visibility dropped to nothing despite the water being clear from above, and they said they could feel something below them. Not see, feel, pressure, awareness, mass, without shape. They came up after 12 minutes, refused to go back down. One of them, a man named Rick Halverson, who'd been diving rescue for 15 years, quit the volunteer squad that week. Told his wife he'd felt something look at him. Not with eyes, just attention. directed at him specifically from below. 3 days after Christine went under, she walked out of the water. Same spot she'd gone in. Middle of the afternoon. A fisherman on the main basin saw her, just a girl in a swimsuit, walking up the gravel beach, like she'd been for a casual swim. She was warm. Her body temperature was 103, and it stayed there for 2 weeks. Didn't fluctuate. She couldn't speak for the first 3 days. Not that she was injured, her throat worked fine, she just didn't have words. Like language had been temporarily removed from her and was being given back slowly. When she could talk, she didn't say much. Didn't remember being under the water. Didn't remember 3 days passing, but she said one thing that I wrote down because I was the county health officer at the time and I was taking her statement. She said, "It's not angry, it just needs the warm to stay." Helen looked at me steadily. That's a direct quote. I wrote it down in 1986 and I've never forgotten it. What did she mean? I asked. I don't know. I don't think she fully knew either. But I took it seriously. After Christine came back, I started talking to the year-round residents, quietly, one at a time, and I found out that people had known about the arm for much longer than I'd realized. Not officially, not scientifically, but in the way that people who live on a lake for generations know things about the water. They knew it was warm over there. They knew fish avoided it. They knew that sometimes, on very still nights, you could see light from below. And they knew in the way, you know, not to touch an electric fence without anyone explaining volts to you that you didn't go there. The property owners on the western arm had been living with increasing unease for years. The warmth was spreading, they said, slowly inches per year, but the thermal boundary was extending further from the center of the arm. In the 70s, you had to go 30 yards from shore to feel it. By 1986, it started at the waterline. After Christine, they all agreed to leave, voluntarily. We helped them set up the land trust to explain the transfers publicly. No one was forced. They were relieved, and I filed the cessation memo and made sure no county employee would have a reason to go there. She stopped rocking, fixed me with a look that was neither harsh nor gentle, just precise. That was 32 years ago. In that time, the thermal boundary has not advanced beyond the arm. The glow appears every night, but doesn't leave the arm. No one else has entered the water, and nothing has come out. What is it? I asked. I don't know. Nobody does. It's been there longer than the lake has had people on it. The geological survey from the 50s noted it. The Ojibwe people who lived here before European settlement had a name for this lake that translates, roughly I'm told, to lake with a living floor. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's one thing or a process or something else entirely. I know it's warm. I know it's aware. And I know it doesn't bother anyone who doesn't go looking. She leaned forward slightly. But I also know this. The only people that ever reached for Christine, the divers, were the ones who went back more than once. Christine went in once and was taken and returned. The divers went in once and were frightened and left. No one who went only once was ever affected beyond the initial experience. You went twice, she said, and now your hands are warm. That's the boundary. That's where it starts. If you stay away from the water, all of it, not just the arm, for the next week, the warmth will fade. Your body will reset. You'll be fine. Normal. And if I go back? Helen sat back. Then I don't know. Christine went once and came back human. The divers went once and came back frightened. Nobody has gone 3 times, and I would prefer that nobody ever does. I drove back to my cabin slowly. The sun was dropping toward the tree line, and the lake was gold and still. Beautiful. The kind of evening that reminds you why people live in places like this. The light, the quiet, the smell of warm pine and clean water. My hands were warm against the steering wheel. I was aware of it now in a way that I couldn't set aside. Not uncomfortable. The opposite. It felt like holding something alive, a gentle, steady radiance in my palms that pulsed so faintly I might have imagined it if I hadn't spent 2 days confirming it with a thermometer. And that was the problem. It didn't feel like contamination. It didn't feel like damage. It felt like warmth on a cool evening. It felt like being held, like something large and patient
was maintaining a connection through my skin, not to harm me, but because the connection itself was what it wanted. Contact. Sustained contact. Helen had said to stay away from the water for a week. All water, not just the arm. I understood why. The lake was one body. What lived in the western arm was connected to the entire basin through the same water column. If the mechanism was thermal, if it communicated through heat and proximity, then any contact with the lake was theoretically contact with it. But I was a lake maintenance worker. My job was being on the water every day. My housing was 30 feet from the shore. Staying away from Prosper Lake for a week meant, functionally, not doing my job. I sat on my porch that evening and did not look west. I looked at my phone instead, checked the weather, read the news, anything to keep my eyes off the water. But I could feel it anyway, that 30-second rhythm, not through the floor, not through the air, through my hands, like they'd become receivers tuned to a frequency I couldn't shut off. I told myself I would call Marla in the morning and resign. I would explain that I had a family situation, something vague and inarguable, and I would leave by the end of the week. Drive south, let the warmth fade like Helen promised. Get on with my life. That was my plan. It was a good plan, and I believed it completely right up until 2 a.m. Thursday morning when I woke up standing on my dock in bare feet, both hands submerged to the wrists in the lake, and no memory of how I'd gotten there. The water was warm around my hands, not lake temperature warm, western arm warm, 80 degrees, maybe more, and my hands weren't just submerged. They were open, palms down, fingers spread, like I was pressing them flat against something solid just below the surface, except there was nothing solid there, just water, just warmth, just that 30-second pulse moving up through my wrists and into my forearms like a slow, deep current of recognition. I pulled my hands out, stepped back from the edge of the dock. My feet were bare and wet. I'd walked from my bed, through the cabin, out the screen door, and down 30 feet of gravel path without waking up. The screen door was still open behind me, yellow light from the kitchen falling in a rectangle across the porch. I stood there for maybe a full minute, hands dripping, chest trying to understand what had just happened. Sleepwalking. That was the rational explanation. People sleepwalk. Stress, disrupted sleep patterns, unfamiliar environment, all documented triggers. I'd been anxious. I'd been fixated on the lake. My unconscious mind had simply acted on the fixation while I slept. But my hands had known where to go. Palms down, fingers spread. Not the posture of someone stumbling off a dock in confusion. The posture of someone completing a gesture they'd practiced. I went inside, dried my hands, locked the screen door, then, after a moment, locked the interior door too. I checked the time, 2:07 a.m. I sat at the kitchen table and did not go back to sleep. At 6, I called Marla. "I'm done," I said. "I need to leave. End of the week." She was quiet for a beat, not surprised. "Okay, I'll process the separation paperwork today. You can turn in the boat key and sampling kit Friday morning." "Marla, last night I woke up on the dock. My hands were in the water." Another pause, longer than Thursday. "What? It's Thursday. You woke up on a Thursday night?" She said it like it confirmed something. "The warmth in your hands, it's stronger at night, isn't it? And stronger toward the end of the week?" I hadn't tracked it consciously, but she was right. The warmth was cyclical. Tuesday it had been faint, noticeable, but easy to dismiss. By Wednesday evening it had been constant, and Thursday at 2 a.m. my body had walked itself to the water without my consent. Has this happened to other people? Not for a long time. The last seasonal worker who went to the arm was in 2004. She didn't go back twice, though. She felt the warmth once, and she was smart enough to never get in the water again. It faded in 4 days. I went twice. Yes, and that's why you need to leave Friday. Don't go near the water today. Not for work, not for any reason. Call in sick. Stay in the cabin. Keep the doors locked tonight. Why tonight specifically? Her voice was careful, measured. Because if Thursday night pulled you to the dock, Friday night might pull you further. And once you're in the water fully in, not just your hands, I don't know what the distance is. I don't know if the arm matters anymore at that point, or if the whole lake becomes the arm. I didn't argue. I didn't push back.
The memory of my hands spread flat on the water's surface, palms pressing downward like they were greeting something, was too immediate and too physical to intellectualize. "Friday morning," I said. "I'll be at the office at 8. "Good, and tonight I mean this, don't open the doors. Even if you wake up standing, even if it feels like the right thing to do, it will feel right. That's how it works. It doesn't scare you out. It warms you in." I spent Thursday inside. All of it. Blinds closed on the lakeside. I read a paperback I'd brought, but never opened some thriller I can't remember the title of now. I ate canned soup for lunch and a sandwich for dinner. I did not look at the water. I did not go on the porch. But I felt it all day. The warmth in my hands had spread to my wrists by noon. By evening, it was in my forearms, a deep, radiant heat that wasn't uncomfortable. That's what made it so difficult. It felt good, like being slowly wrapped in something that knew exactly the temperature your body wanted. Not hot, not feverish, just perfect, sustaining warmth that made the rest of the world feel slightly cold by comparison. At 9 p.m., I moved the kitchen table in front of the interior door, not because I thought it would physically stop me if I sleepwalked. I'm not a large person, but I could move a table in my sleep if my body wanted to. I did it because I thought the sound of it scraping on the floor might wake me up, an alarm made of friction and furniture. I lay down at 10. I did not expect to sleep, but I did quickly, heavily, like dropping into warm water. I woke at 2:03 a.m. I was standing at the interior door. My hands were on the table, palms flat, pressing it away from the door. I'd already moved it 6 inches. The scraping sound was what woke me, my own desperate architecture working exactly as planned. I stepped back. My hands were radiating heat. I could see it, or I imagined I could see it, a faint shimmer in the air above my palms, like pavement on a hot day. My heart was hammering, but beneath the hammering, beneath the panic, there was something else. A pull, not in my mind, in my chest. A slow, deep tug that matched the 30-second rhythm exactly, as if something had reached up through the water, across 30 feet of gravel and wood and locked doors, and hooked itself to the cavity behind my sternum. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall, and I did not move until dawn. 4 hours. I counted the pulls. Every 30 seconds, 144 of them, before the light came through the blinds, and the warmth in my hands retreated. Not gone, but reduced, banked, waiting. Friday morning, I was at the park's office at 7:45. Marla was already there. I turned in the boat key, the sampling kit, and the GPS unit, and the laminated protocol card. She processed it all silently, filling out forms with her usual efficiency. When everything was signed, she looked at me. "Drive south. Don't stop at any lake, any river, any body of water for at least 100 miles. When you get where you're going, stay out of water for a week. Showers are fine. Baths are..." She hesitated. "Keep showers short. Don't linger." "Will it stop?" "For the people who only went once, yes. Within days. For you," she set her pen down, "I'm going to be honest with you. You went twice, and you put your hands in twice, and your body went to the water on its own once. That's more contact than anyone since Christine. I think it will fade. I believe that, but I don't know how long. Months?" Helen's best guess was weeks. She dealt with Christine's follow-up for about a month before the girl's temperature normalized. But Christine was 17 and resilient, and she never went back to the lake after. She moved to Fargo and never returned. It faded for her. And if it doesn't fade for me? Marla didn't answer that. She just held my gaze for a long moment, and in her expression I saw something I hadn't expected. Guilt. She'd hired me. She'd put me on this lake without warning what was in it. And whatever she told herself about the arrangement, that it was safe, that people only got hurt if they went looking, she knew there was a gap between the silence that protected the community and the ignorance that endangered people like me. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have told you on day one. But the last 5 seasonal workers, 8 years, none of them ever asked. None of them went west. You were the first one in 15 years who didn't just accept the map. I took my final check, loaded my truck,
and left Prosper Lake at 9:15 on a Friday morning in June. I did not look at the western arm as I drove the North Shore Road toward the highway. I kept my eyes on the pavement and my hands on the wheel, and I drove south until Minnesota was behind me, and the only water I could see was rain.
That was 7 months ago. I'm in Nebraska now. Small city, landlocked. The nearest body of water larger than a swimming pool is a reservoir 11 miles outside town, and I've never been to it. I work at a hardware store, normal life, normal routine, the kind of existence that doesn't require proximity to water of any kind. The warmth in my hands lasted 5 weeks. It faded gradually, retreating from my forearms first, then my wrists, then my palms, until by the 6th week I could hold a glass of ice water without the ice melting faster than it should. My body temperature normalized to 98.6 by the end of July. I went to a doctor in August for an unrelated issue, a persistent cough, and my vitals were perfectly ordinary, nothing measured, except every Thursday night I wake at 2 a.m. Exactly. Without an alarm, without variation, without any sleep disturbance that precedes it. I simply open my eyes and I am awake, and my hands are warm, and I can feel faintly, so faintly, I could convince myself it's imaginary, that 30-second pulse, not in the floor, not in the air, in my chest, behind my ribs, a single, low throb, then silence, then another, as if something 400 miles north is breathing on a schedule my body still honors. It lasts about 10 minutes, then it fades. I go back to sleep. In the morning, my hands are normal temperature, and I go to work. And I don't think about it until the next Thursday. It's not getting worse. I want to be clear about that. It's not spreading. It's not intensifying. It's just persistent. A residual frequency that my body acquired during those 2 visits to warm water, and that has not fully released me despite, time and distance and the complete absence of any lake in my daily life. But here's what I don't tell anyone. Here's the thing that keeps me in Nebraska, in a landlocked city, working a job I'm overqualified for, living a life that's small and dry and safe. I want to go back. Not constantly, not desperately, just present. A warmth in the back of my mind that matches the warmth that was in my hands. A feeling like I left something unfinished. Like the connection I felt on that dock at 2 a.m. wasn't an intrusion, but an invitation I interrupted. And the wanting doesn't crescendo. It doesn't build to a breaking point. It just stays, exactly calibrated to the level I can bear without acting on it. Never enough to overwhelm my rational mind. Always enough that I can't forget, as if it knows my threshold, as if it measured me during those 2 visits and calculated precisely how much pull I can carry indefinitely without either surrendering or being free. A permanent low-grade warmth that is not an emergency and is not an illness, and is not anything I could explain to a doctor or a friend or anyone who hasn't felt that water. I looked up Christine once. The girl from 1986. Found a public records listing in Fargo. She'd have been 49 by then. The listing was current. She was alive, apparently functional, apparently normal. But her address was as far from any named body of water as Fargo geography allows. And I understood that perfectly. Last week I was at the hardware store and a customer came in asking about dock hardware, galvanized lag bolts, stainless steel brackets, the same materials I'd spent a summer working with. He was talking about his lake property somewhere in Wisconsin, not even the same state. And as he described the water, the dock, the evening light on the surface, I felt my hands warm. Briefly, maybe 5 seconds. Then it passed. I rang up his purchase and didn't say anything. But that night, Thursday night, the 2 a.m. pulse was slightly longer than usual, 12 minutes instead of 10, and the warmth was in my wrists, not just my palms, just barely, just enough to notice. I'm still here. I'm still choosing. And the choosing is real. I believe that. But I also know that something in a Minnesota lake reached into my body during 2 visits and 60 seconds of total water contact, and it has not let go. Not completely, not yet. The western arm is still there. Marla is still there. Helen is still there. The community still arcs wide and doesn't talk about it. And somewhere in the county's filing system, there's a map with 12 active sectors and 1 gray zone labeled with 3 words that I now understand were never a bureaucratic designation. Sector 7, no service. It was never about what the county wouldn't provide to that stretch of water. It was about what the water wouldn't stop providing to anyone who came close enough to receive it.